All right, here we are. So, a time of total war. I mean, war is pretty much a constant in historical societies, and it's very hard to find a year or time where there isn't war. And yet, one of the features that Barbara Tuchman, the great popular historian who described the 14th century as the calamitous century, emphasized in her discussions was that there was near constant war. We'll talk about those few years where peace seemed to spread across Europe. Uh, and 14th century warfare is also a time of some interesting developments and shifts in the practice of war. So, students who are also enrolled in early modern war, some of this may sound familiar as kind of evoking the background to the start of our course. So, let's look at 14th century warfare. Let's look at how practice of war is shifting, growing, what's changing. So, late medieval warfare. If you talk to military history geeks, one of the things that they'll identify in terms of the historical argument is that the late Middle Ages, the period of the 13th, 14th, and early 15th century, was a time when the infantry revolution, a rise and a shift in the way infantry warfare was conceived, practiced, and becomes central to the deployment of armies, to the use of warfare. That's the big thing. So historians identify an infantry revolution. Doesn't mean that there weren't infantry soldiers before the 13th century, of course not. But that in the 11th and 12th century, the Europeans had undergone what we call a cavalry revolution. You could even trace it way back to the days of Charlemagne, the Carolingians, and the Franks, from the development of stirrups to the rise of this heavy cavalry, the cataphracts of the Byzantine Empire. Cavalry had been where it was at. But cavalry is expensive. To be an effective cavalry uh, warrior, you need to have more than one horse. You need to have the people to support your horse. So you need a whole retinue. And thus, knights dominated this cavalry warfare within Europe. There are, of course, other forms of cavalry warfare beyond the armored knights. We can think of the light cavalry, and all of you who studied the Mongols in some extent or another, or looked at them, you might look at those, or the Ottomans with their use of light cavalry. For the Europeans, it was mostly heavy cavalry. This was expensive and rare. But infantry was relatively cheap to do. Give some guys a bunch of, well, not swords, that requires more specialist training, but you can give them a variety of simple weapons, get them out there in the fields. Those commoners could serve and did in medieval armies, usually during the summertime between sowing and harvesting. You could turn a number of farmers into soldiers for a short duration. But you didn't have much of a professional army. And that made it difficult for infantry to sustain nonstop warfare during the high European Middle Ages. But in the 13th century, oh, there we go. I see somebody's making a comment. So I will pull that in. Let's see. It is just going to pause share for a moment. Okay. Yep. Gabrielle and Victoria, some good points there. What did they feed the soldiers to keep them going? Bread mostly. Yeah, bread was a real staple. Soups and gruels made of lentils. You have a diet that includes a fair bit of carbohydrates, a fair bit of vegetable protein, some cured meat could be carried on campaign, but you often just got whatever the heck it was you could get from your uh, sort of ground. So basically, we're foraging. Um, some cheese too. Yes, cheese would also hold well. Um, but you have a lot of cases where people are foraging. Uh, there's not a great army supply going on. Okay, Zoom share. And so one of the ways, the big innovations that we see in European warfare in the 13th century and really taking off in the 14th century is the rise of mercenary forces. Now, we're not talking about a lot of guys in cool black uniforms doing, all sorts of crazy things. But the mercenaries were basically ways of providing a professional level, continuing military ability. These guys were in it for their work. The first famous military company we know of is a group I mentioned with regards to the Byzantine Empire in one of our previous classes, the Catalan Company. So they're from Catalonia in Spain. They had been assembled from veterans of the Spanish Peninsular Wars, and now they offered their services to the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus, which was sort of a mixed blessing in a way. Remember, Andronicus puts all of his money into hiring mercenaries, draws so much from his own soldiers that he kind of depresses their ability to fill in the service. And the Catalan Company rebels against that. There's, a bit of payback. But mercenary forces, we see the rise of a whole bunch of famous mercenary companies. The first company of St. George shows up in Italy in 1339. The Great Company, led by a German knight and active again in Italy, shows up in 1342. So there are mercenary forces, and they're drawing on the experience. Some people move over from being foot soldiers in military activity. Some are cavalry soldiers, but most of them are foot soldiers in the mercenary forces. The image you see here, the picture of these group of soldiers, that is an image of the Catalan Company itself. So they're not wearing uniforms. They're not even uniformly equipped, though these guys do have swords. These guys are skilled enough to be able to do that. All right, again, I'm going to just stop share for a moment, take a look at the comments. Nice helmets, yeah. All right. And so let's move along. All right. The most famous medieval mercenary is an Englishman by birth, but who became eventually a citizen of Florence through his service there, John Hawkwood, condottieri of the Second Company of St. George, one of the great mercenary companies. So we don't know a lot about Hawkwood's background in England, but we do know that he must have assembled quite an experience as a soldier before circa 1360. He joins a company and he is quite successful. So he rises with his military skills and becomes a great leader in the mercenary company, serving successfully the Pope, the Florentines, and other Italian city-states. Remember, the middle of the 14th century, the papacy is resident in Avignon, and they kind of not welcome anymore in Rome. The Roman nobles would like to have their independence, their rule there recognized. The other city-states of Florence are kind of caught between occasional influxes from the Holy Roman Empire, which still thinks they're in charge of Italy, their own sort of local rivalries, the Florentines versus the Milanese, the Venetians, the Genoese. You've got all this back and forth going on. There's a lot of opportunity to make some serious coin going to war. All right, let's see. Pausing share again for a moment. Going to see what's going on in chat. Cool. So first question, James. Do you see the development of the Swiss mercenaries here? They actually come into their own about a century later, the 15th century. The Swiss pikemen and their mercenary prowess and practice really takes off. But yeah, it grows out of this mercenary movement starting in the early 14th century. So the Swiss are going to be kind of one of the most advanced developments in the 15th century, and they in turn go for hire, as you say, like the papacy. And today the Swiss Guard of the papacy is a descendant of that. How organized would these mercenaries be? They had mercenary codes, which weren't all fellowship and fun. This included what every soldier was expected to do, the authority that he had to recognize in the company. So company hierarchies were pretty serious. And if you were lower down on there, you had to do what the bosses said. So this is big business. Think of it this way. Big business with these guys moving around, selling their services to different providers, different buyers. We know that the French king, we'll be talking about him, he hired mercenaries. So it's not just small cities and small centers getting into the mercenary business. So they're signing contracts, they're doing business, and they're getting rich off of it. Was there sort of a mafia at the time? People will tell you that the mafia has a long history. There's not really anything quite like the mafia that we would see today, but great families, leading cities definitely had, and there are some unofficial and quite ruthless ways in which people avenged crimes on themselves and their relatives. So I'd say not really the mafia, but uh, a land where mercenary companies roamed widely, worked for the biggest authorities, not exactly a stable place you'd like to be. All right, resume sharing. So let's see. There we go. So moving on from John Hawkwood. It's really cool. There's a couple historical novels about him you can find. I'm going to talk about what's changing. So far we've looked sort of in Western Europe. I want to just mention some innovations and happenings in Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, to be honest. The Francocratia. So again, talking about the Byzantine Empire, talking about how the Byzantines had to build themselves back up from the Fourth Crusade. The collective term we give for all of the petty states that are in Eastern Europe out of the Fourth Crusade is from the Greeks' own term. They called it the Francocratia. And from about 1205 to 1432, there's a mishmash of states that are under the thumb of individual European warlord dynasties or some of these Italian states. So when they're not fighting amongst themselves on the Italian peninsula, they're fighting amongst themselves or with others in the Greek islands, on the Greek peninsula, throughout the Balkans. They're in Turkey as well. So the Franks are kind of roaming free. And I give an end date of 1432. Some of these states and cities and strongholds held by the Western Europeans in Eastern Europe remain into the 16th, 17th century. The Venetians have the Stato de Mar, which refers to their overseas territories, some of them up into the Black Sea, going into quite a while. One of the most successful of these Franco-Cratic states was the Kingdom of Albania, held by the Angevins, that dynasty of Charles of Anjou, who was such a problem for the Byzantines. This is the Angevin, same royal family we're talking about here. And Albania, we recognize being a territory in the Balkans. That flourished until it was sort of consumed by the warfare we talked about this past week with the Serbians, with the Byzantines, with the Ottomans. Now, one really neat innovation in the East was the rebuilding, the expansion of a centralized shipbuilding and military provisioning center in Venice, the Arsenal. I've mentioned this a bit as well in my early modern warfare class. The Arsenal of Venice was a protected area where the Venetians, who specialized in maritime activity, built ships for commerce and ships for war, and also added in, during the gunpowder revolution of this 14th century, the ability to create artillery pieces. The image you see on this slide is of a Venetian ship. Like I said, they're trading all over the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, where they have their strongholds. So they need Constantinople to be in friendly hands so they can get through the Straits of the Bosphorus. Now, one other group, and for those of you interested in the crusading orders, we've talked about the Templars, we talked about others. Well, the Knights Hospitallers, there's one of the orders, become in 1312 the Knights of Rhodes. So if anybody who's a classic student here might recognize the mention of Rhodes, it's an important city in Eastern Mediterranean. In 1312, the Knights Hospitaller move in, take that over. That becomes their stronghold, and they'll hold it, defend that right up into the 1530s, the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, when he takes Rhodes in an attack. So being able to fight on land, being able to fight on sea, fighting all the time, like I said, it's pretty characteristic across 14th century Europe. So let's move on to today's particular case study, my favorite, yours, the 100 Years' War, where the biggest thing to remember is it doesn't last exactly 100 years, right? From 1337 to 1453, on and off, the English and French are at war over their rival claims to rule the Kingdom of France. So let's begin by looking at the causes. So in 1328, the last Capetian king of France dies, and the French really were faced with a dilemma. They could keep it in the Capetian line, but they would have to recognize inheritance through a woman. They could either recognize one of the daughters of the recent kings, or they could recognize the surviving daughter of their father, gone through 3 of his sons. And remember that the French had long leaned on the idea that succession to the crown could only go through men. An obscure law of one section of the early medieval Frankish kingdoms, the Salian Franks, had said that no women shall inherit in Frankish lands. So that meant no property could be inherited by a woman. So even though the proposition was not to crown one of these female contenders as queen, but to pass it on to her son, the general consensus was no. Because, of course, these women had married outside of the French royal stronghold and family. So instead, Philip, who was descendant of one of these sort of cadet branches of the French royal families, Philip is crowned the first king of the new dynasty, the Valois dynasty. And one of the groups that he had disinherited by this was the line of Isabella of France, who had married into the English royal family. She had married King Edward II, and Isabella had borne Edward a son and heir, the future Edward III. And then Isabella sort of got her lover to take her husband, dethrone him, and reputedly have him mysteriously murdered by being stuck up the behind with a hot poker. So the story goes. It would show no signs of foul play. Oh no, the smoking smell might have done something. Anyway, so there's a bit of a grudge already between the English and the French. If you remember, we talked about in the 13th century, the English and French had been at war. English kings had claim to some territory still in the crown of France. Though John had lost most everything, 14th century English kings were still recognized as dukes in Guyenne or Aquitaine. But in 1337, Philip of Valois, Philip of France, confiscated that territory from the English, claiming that the English refused to do proper obeisance, proper feudal recognition of Philip's authority there. I think he had been biding his time and wanting to do this. He felt that the English were distracted with problems at home, that whole overthrow of Edward II, and the minority government with son and mom at war in England. It's messy. But 1337, we have the French seize Aquitaine, and the English can either acquiesce to that, say okay, or they can say no way. And Edward goes for number 2. Young Edward, who has finally overthrown his mother's influence and establishing himself on the throne, also says, I'm claiming France. Thanks, Mom, for the bloodline, but nothing else I want from you. And I am King of England. I'm the rightful king of France as well. So I've taken some images here you'll recognize from the textbook for breaking the war down into 2 main periods. We're not going to talk about the Middle War, that's messy. But for the first few years, there's not a lot of big stuff going on. There are some individual sieges of strongholds, but it's not until 1340 we have a major engagement going on in the 100 Years' War, and it's, interestingly enough, a naval battle. Neither the English nor the French were in possession of a great purpose-built navy. The Battle of Sluys is fought with a lot of Northern European cargo ships, merchant vessels, hastily converted, and a few warships as well. So it is the opening sally in the war. In 1346, we have one of the most famous battles of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Crécy. It comes at the culmination of a long English campaign led by King Edward III, marching through France and ending at Crécy, where he meets a French battle on the field. So it's what we might call a pitched battle or a field battle. And it is overwhelmingly, despite the English having been tired on the run, an English success. They beat their French opponents at Crécy. They're able to force then some advances here. We also have in that year the Siege of Calais. Now, Calais had long been held as an English outpost and stronghold. You see up here in northern France, the one area, the one region that's identified as an English stronghold as compared to the territories of Aquitaine, and that's where Calais is. The French are pushing back, and if they can take Calais, they can take England's northern landfall, northern port. in France. That would be serious. They don't. Spoiler alert, Calais does not fall to the French until 1559. During the 1340s, late 1340s, what big event happens that changes all of European history? 1348, you guys know it's the Black Death. And I told you last class, the Black Death kind of led to an enforced truce. The English and French stopped fighting with each other, not because they want to, but because they have no other choice, really. They don't have the soldiers, they can't get the soldiers. Nobody is going to try to campaign when they are ill with bubonic plague. So we do have a few years where the church is able to broker a peace between the opposing parties. But war returns again in the early 1350s. And another series of English campaigns roaming through France, coming out of Aquitaine and moving across the region, leads to the Battle of Poitiers. And the Battle of Poitiers is a real game changer in the early war. A stunning English victory over the French and their international allies. This is the battle where blind King John of Bavaria dies, gallantly riding into war with his companions who have tied their horses to his own so he could go fight. Oh, I'm seeing some comments here, so we'll pause for a moment and I can see what that is. Did the French forces ever contemplate an invasion of England in this war? Yes, they did. By gosh. I should mention some of the English ports, Portsmouth most famously, were raided. The Channel Islands as well were attacked by the French. They did not manage. The last great French invasion of England had been during the reign of King John, and that had been successful for a while, but they weren't able to do it this time. So the Battle of Poitiers ends with the capture of the French king as well. And it is the Battle of Poitiers then that leads eventually to fairly punitive terms of peace. The French are expected to pay an enormous ransom to restore their king to them, and that's tough. The English are recognized in their occupation of a much larger swath of France than before. So, I mean, it's not making the English kings of France, but it's making the English the big power brokers and giving them a lot of wealth. Now, the Battle of Poitiers, though, didn't change everything. King Charles V, when he comes to the throne after his father's death, works really hard, and we have a series of hard-working campaigns by the French to restore French control, to cut back on this English pale, this English stronghold. And he's pretty successful. Charles V goes bit by bit, stronghold after stronghold, castle after castle, city after city, to try to make his way through. And by about 1374, 1375, we're pretty much back towards the status at the start of the war. The English have a little more territory than what they started with, but the French kings are still the French kings. Now, I thought this would be time for a little palate breaker rather than dealing with the messy middle part of the 100 Years' War, which involves lots of horrible slash and burn campaigns throughout parts of northern and southern France by the English, and lots of nasty stronghold battles. We talk a bit about the 14th century is also the age where this whole chivalric medieval culture comes up. And so at the same time that they are burning down, peasant homes after looting them of everything that's worth of any value to the soldiers, you're having the elites in medieval society creating this big chivalric myth. Like, this is the round table that was supposedly found by Edward III. It's been repainted in Tudor times. But this was supposed to be King Arthur's Round Table. I mean, King Arthur, the ultimate chivalrous dude, right? Here he is, and he is a genuine English hero, man. We're at war in the middle of the 14th century. We can have this round table. And Edward also creates this chivalric order, the Order of the Garter, which still exists today in England. You have members of the Order of the Garter, uh, including the monarch and sometimes great nobles and foreign notables. You want to get on your side. Hey, want to be part of our chivalric order? Do that. A few years later, the French follow suit, creating their first chivalric order, the Order of the Star. Um, we have the Burgundians, and we'll be talking about the Burgundians in the end of the class. Have the Order of the Golden Fleece, which also is a big international diplomatic carrot. And then the French create a new order, a new improved order in 1469, the Order of St. Michael's. So chivalric orders are an excuse to wear fancy jewelry, have big parties, and celebrate how cool and knightly you are in the theoretical. This is the same era that gives us chivalric stories. Like I said, the Round Table of King Arthur. In the 15th century, Thomas Malory writes down and sort of refines a lot of the Arthurian stories going around at the time in his book, The Morte d'Arthur. So if you're familiar at all with medieval English literature, this is one of the big elements in here. It gives us a lot of the stories of King Arthur and his court and the chivalric actions. There's even a woman who is one of the famous contributors to this chivalric literary culture, Christine de Pizan, who writes the book of Deeds of Arms and Chivalry, which she shares with her patrons in the French court in 1410. So Christine, whose family was from Pisa and became great French courtiers, or minor French courtiers, I guess I should say, was also one of the big literary sources of the time. All right, going to pause so I can see our comments here. How much truth do we think there is to Arthurian legends? Oh, that's a big question. Every now and then somebody will come up with a new idea. Oh, they were Sarmatians on service in late Roman Britain or whatever. We do have, the neatest thing is the site of Tintagel, which is a castle in western Cornwall, associated being the birthplace of Arthur. We do have a sign that it was occupied by some sort of elite group in this time period. But there's no smoking gun, there's no clear signs, there's no historical Arthur. There's lots of bits and pieces, so there's lots of stuff that goes from real interesting archaeology, a few literary mentions from the 5th and 6th century by, basically somebody who heard something or had this, guy. So it's pretty light. Chrétien de Troyes, remember the troubadours? They sort of take the story and run with it. Chrétien de Troyes invents, and the other troubadours invent Lancelot, the character of Lancelot, and a lot of the supporting characters we think of who are key to the Arthurian myth. And now in the 14th century, we're dialing it up big time and making it this big social, big political event. So, resuming share. There we go. So, to some extent, in the early 15th century, the Hundred Years' War had become kind of a Cold War. There were the armed strongholds that the English held in disputed territory in France, but there wasn't a lot going on. The English had their own problems there. We might talk about them later in the course if we have the time, but you can read about the reign of Edward the Third ending, and we'll talk about some other things. But suffice it to say, in 1415, a new English king comes to the throne, and that would be Henry V. And Henry V decides to heat the wars up again. goes on campaign, and we have a very deadly, very disappointing series of marches across northern France, trying to get down towards Paris, being sort of blocked at that point, coming back around, trying to get home when they are intercepted by the French army, a far larger force, full of knights, whereas the English are heavy on infantry, who are distracted by suffering from dysentery and other diseases, but nevertheless managed to bring out a somewhat seemingly miraculous victory, at least to the chroniclers of the time, at the Battle of Agincourt. More practically, we like to say it's probably the evidence that success was brought by the English archers, but a miracle is a miracle if you're writing up the stories. I see another comment here, so let's pause so I can get that up. Where was the French court held at this point? I see Paris is controlled by the English. This map's a little bit later than Agincourt. This is going to be when we're looking after 1422. So this map is also in your textbook, by the way, if you want to look a little bit more explanation. But yeah, this is the English do not control Paris when Henry is coming to the throne. But he's going to make it possible for them to do that. So the Battle of Agincourt is a big win for Henry V, but it doesn't get him everything. I mean, it gets him so that he's beaten the French pretty decisively, but he's got a few troops, got to go home. But he is able to build upon this in a series of subsequent campaigns. The French are also troubled by having a king who has bouts of insanity. King Charles was dealing with mental illness at this point, and eventually tired, worn out, I would also say defeated by internal divisions within the French royal family. A dispute emerged between the French king and his current heir, the Dauphin. The French were convinced to sign the Treaty of Troyes with England in 1420, which recognized Henry V of England as the heir to the French throne. Not the Dauphin, not the son of the French king, but Henry of England. Through right of conquest, but also through his marriage to a French princess, Catherine, sort of bringing the dynasties together. This was going to be the agreement. The only problem was Henry V would have to be continuing some of his campaigns. Supporters of the ousted Dauphin, defenders of a French monarchy, didn't like the agreement of the treaty. What kings agreed to isn't what everybody else agrees to. And so 1422, Henry is on campaign in disputed territory of France. He gets ill. What illness do you think Henry contracts on campaign? What? Yep. It is indeed. It's dysentery. Like I said, there should be like an extra credit question on the final exam, the take-home exam, just describing, dysentery. Identify somebody who died of dysentery. Here you would go. There'd be so many. All right. Sorry, going back there. Going back to the late war. So Henry V predeceases his father-in-law. A few weeks later, King Charles of France dies, and the heir to both, if you agree with that treaty, which not everybody did, would be the infant Henry VI of England or Henry I of France. And by the way, he is Henry I in the numbering of French monarchs, just to give you that fun. Yeah, my internet's being a little unstable too. We're lucky to have anything going at this point. So the 1420s is a time when this orange spread across France. The English growth really works. This is what the English are at their height, but they're doing it because Henry V's brothers are enforcing the rule. The Duke of Bedford is being a warlord here in France and fighting battles on behalf of his nephew, the infant king. But look at the large purple area in the south representing supporters of the ousted Dauphin. They're pushing hard, and in 1429 they get that critical boost. Joan of Arc begins her campaigns here. She hears voices from God, right? Well, from the saints, and she's going to put the Dauphin on the throne. In that year, she relieves the siege of Orleans. She helps to make it possible to crown Charles in the traditional coronation cathedral in Reims. She helps to turn the tide for supporters of the French monarchy. And remember, the English king's now still a young child. Sure, they've celebrated a coronation for him in Paris, but it's not the same thing, man. The story of the English move towards defeat, towards ouster in France, takes a long time. Joan herself will die in the 1430s, captured by the English allies, the Burgundians. See the Duchy of Burgundy over here. When the English are allied with the Burgundians, that helps them. When the English lose that alliance, we'll be talking about the Burgundians and their roles. It hurts them. By the 1450s, the English are no longer able to sustain what they have been doing. Their holdings are going to be reduced to small bits of land. By 1453, the Hundred Years' War comes to the end with a series of resounding English defeats in the north and in the south. England, as I said, continues to hold a small territory, what we call the Pale of Calais up here in Normandy, but it's just a small area around the port of Calais. The English are gone out of France. The English have lost the 100 Years' War. So you can win the battle very famously, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, but you can lose the war. Now, one of the ways you lose the war is by not having those international allies. Yeah, you can give them the membership of the Order of the Garter or the Order of St. Michael, but how do you keep them on your side? The power brokers are really interesting here. The last little bit we'll be talking about in class are the Valois Dukes of Burgundy. And yes, that name sounds familiar. Valois. What are they doing? All right, so the Duchy of Burgundy. We saw that in yellow on the last map. Now it's sort of a patchwork here. Burgundy, we're all familiar with Burgundy the region, Burgundy the drink, Burgundy the color, but Burgundy is a political creation. There had been a Duchy of Burgundy throughout the High Middle Ages. In 1363, the last Capetian Duke of Burgundy dies, the last Duke of Burgundy who had come out of the old French royal family, the one pre-Hundred Years' War. He dies without an heir. And the French territories in Burgundy, you see these sort of, we've got here territories that they have in 1363 are handed over to the fourth son of the French king, Philip, who will become the first Valois Duke of Burgundy. So he inherits from France all of these Burgundian territories, and he's expected, like a good brother, to use these on behalf of his brother and their descendants, the French king. So that would be Charles the fifth of France. His brother Philip is the Duke of Burgundy, and it lasts. That kind of close connection lasts during their own lifetime. It's one of the reasons why the early 100 Years' War doesn't go so well for the English. But you know, while brothers might be able to work together, uh, as the family connections thin out, that isn't so good. And also the Burgundian dukes are kind of more interested in their own power, their own perspective. And we see in this map from your textbook again how the Burgundians are expanding their territory over the 14th and into the 15th century, some through marriage, some through conquest, um, some through negotiation. And by the end of this, by the later 15th century, the Duchy of Burgundy is, I would say, non-contiguous. The fancy word for it's not all connected. There are like some open spaces here and there, but rather substantial territory that runs from the North Sea down to the borders of the Swiss cantons. It's a big state. And look, here on this side, the Holy Roman Empire, and part of these territories are under the imperial rule. Here on this side, the Kingdom of France, and part of these owe fealty to the Kingdom of France. It's kind of between two makers. But he's a Valois. So, like I said, Prince Philip becomes the first Duke of Burgundy under the Valois dynasty in 1363. And he is expected to promote Valois interests. But in the next generation, there is some tension. We have a minority government for a while, and the various great nobles. In this case, I'll just simplify it to two Valois royal cousins, the Valois who are the Dukes of Orleans, also known as the Armagnac faction, and the Valois who are Duke of Burgundy, the Burgundians. Both of them are part of the Regency Council for the king. Both of them think they know what's best. They're also participants with the Duc de Berry in all of this. But the animosity is deep between these cousins, between Orleans and Burgundy, Armagnac and Burgundy. And it literally comes to blows. We have in 1407, during a meeting of the Orleans and Burgundian leadership, the assassination of Louis the First, Duke of Orleans, by Burgundians. A generation later, the Burgundian Duke is assassinated during a parley by supporters of Orleans aligned with the French heir to the throne, the Dauphin. So we're going to sort of dive in a bit on that 1419 event, because remember, 1419 comes after the Battle of Agincourt, and as Henry V of England is pushing his campaign to become heir to the French throne. And in 1419, the official heir to the French throne, the Dauphin, is collaborating in the assassination of the Duke of Burgundy. Do you think the Duke of Burgundy is going to be super excited to support the French crown and the Dauphin? Not at all. In fact, this assassination, this event of 1419, moves the Burgundians to make an alliance with the English, and that's part of the reason why Henry V is able to get the treaty the next year, recognizing him as heir in France. The Burgundians help to push and power that English alliance. So Burgundy is an enormous power broker. It might seem like a small territory and indefensible in a lot of ways, but it's really powerful. The heir to John the Fearless, the assassinated Duke, is known as Philip the Good, and he's depicted here in really stylish 15th century clothes. So in 1420, he officially allies with the English, and that's going to be really important. For 15 years, the Burgundians and the English maintain that alliance, and so that's right through the rise of Joan of Arc, and then through her capture by the Burgundians, who hand her over to their English allies. It's not till 1435 that Philip changes sides. He restores an alliance with France. And I think that's very pragmatic. He takes a look around and he realizes that the English aren't doing very well. The English campaigns after the death of the Duke of Bedford are really not very good in northern France. So if Burgundy is going to continue to back England, they're backing a losing force. Better to switch sides, and when they do, as I said, that turns the balance of power in the war entirely over. The English are in a losing situation. How is Burgundy able to be so big, so important? Well, Burgundy does provide troops. It's got actual military forces, and it's not just handing them over to the English. Burgundians are fighting in this. Burgundians also offer financial support, and they are able to do this, create their own armies, offer loans, because they are a very rich territory. I'm going to go backwards for a little bit here to that map. If you take a look here, you'll recognize that a lot of areas we associate with the Dutch urban commercial areas, so important in the early modern period. A lot of very productive regions of farms, countries, commerce are all being touched. Now we're going to move back by the Burgundians. So the Burgundians basically have a cash cow in terms of commerce, in terms of production, goods that are desired across Europe. And Philip is not afraid to tax them pretty heavily. Philip also is kind of working towards almost making a kingdom, and that backfires for him in the 1440s and 1450s. We have an event I learned about as the Burghers' Rebellion, which happens in a lot of those cities up there in the northern Burgundian territory. They're tired of high taxes. They're also angry that Philip is trying to replace their city councils with his own appointed officials. They fight back quite literally. They turn and attack some of the soldiers. They turn and defend the city walls against his forces. It ends eventually disastrously for the cities. Their leaders are captured and executed. The taxes are doubled, as well as gifts are demanded from the city, which end up being devastating for the economy. I'll just mention here the last Valois Duke of Burgundy, a fellow by the name of Charles the Bold, earns that name really well. Charles saw himself as a great warrior. I call him an enthusiastic warrior, and that's saying something. He bought into a lot of the latest technology, the new gunpowder artillery that was out there, and he gambled that Burgundy could fight at the level of the Empire and France. It ends disastrously. He dies actually on the battlefield, the Battle of Nancy, and he leaves only a daughter behind him. She is married into the Holy Roman Empire's family, and this becomes the point where much of the Duchy of Burgundy now is effectively imperial. That will be a crisis for France in the early modern period, but that's beyond us. So that's it for lecture stuff today. I want to remind you our next class will be on the Age of Resistance, looking at common people and their problems. So the Burghers' Rebellion I talked about was kind of a preview of some of that. We're going to be looking at how ordinary people lived during this calamitous 14th century and the 15th century.